And I would often do classes on common counseling problems like depression, and then really difficult counseling problems. But in my class on common counseling problems, we would always cover depression. One of the things we would get into is that there's different strategies of getting out of depression. And we saw already that one of the strategies is learning how to talk to yourself in the presence of God and with the truth of God. That's what we saw in Psalm 42. But what we see from the example of Elijah is a lot more simple and basic. And that is, when your depression and your suicidal thoughts come as a result of a physical low, then it takes a physical solution. I was counseling a couple in the United States and counseling them for quite some time. The wife had a baby, she had depression after she had a baby, but she let herself get quite overweight. And what I told her was, if you want to get out of this depression, why don't you start with 30 minutes of vigorous cardio in the morning and then drop your weight? Because there's a physical aspect to it. She just got to the point where it was hard for her to walk, hard for her to take care of the kid, hard for her to sleep and everything. And she had let her body just completely go after the pregnancy. So I often start my counseling with exploring physical reasons for why it is that people get depressed. And my own self, one of the ways that I deal with depression or even the tendency towards it is I get up in the morning and I do exercise. And I try and do it first thing in the morning because exercise boosts your endorphins and makes you feel better. So if you have good food, not like a donut that's going to raise you up with happiness and crash you down, okay? If you have good food and you have exercise, that can really help with the depression. So God, in a sense, stoops to our physicality by sending the angel. What did the angel give him, verse 6? Gave him something interesting. What did he give him? Two things. Gave him a bread cake on hot stones. What else did he give him? Okay. What did Jesus give to people? What? He gave them bread.
And fish.
And fish. It was better. So, in the Old Testament, you only got bread and water. In the New Testament, you got bread, fish, water, and water that was turned into wine. So, I'll take the New Testament over the Old Testament any day. But when people out there had come to listen to Jesus, he didn't just say, "Oh, you've been spiritually fed." No, he went and got him something to eat. One time, my kids were back in the U.S. for 1 year, but we were having a missionary furlough where you go home and spend a year reporting to your supporting churches. And we were in my hometown of Titusville, Florida, and had opportunity to spend time with my mother, who was sick at that point. But my son was in the band, and he was in the marching band, and they had a big festival on the other side of Florida. So they had to drive 3 hours from Titusville to get to the festival. Well, the bus drivers, now this is in the days before Google Maps, and in the days before cell phones and having Google Maps on your cell phone. So the bus driver makes a lot of mistakes. In fact, she gets completely lost. And so here's the bus driving, and she was leading everybody, and she was just going all over the place. She didn't know where she was going. Well, kids hadn't peed for 3 hours, they hadn't eaten for 3 hours, and they had to arrive, and then they had to play. And I realized we have a problem on our hands. We had kids that were trying to pee into Coke cans, because the lady wouldn't stop the bus, and I was getting really irritated at her. So I did two things. I made her stop the bus so all the kids could pee. And then I figured out what the address was, how to get there. I made some calls. We had a cell phone, but we didn't have smartphones. So I made some calls. I helped her figure out where to go. We have all these kids. You know what I did? I called 3 different Pizza Huts within a 10-mile radius of where everybody was. Pizza Hut's like the best pizza place in the U.S. And I ordered enough pizza for 130 kids in the van. I put it on my charge card, $717. And so that when the kids arrived at the band festival, the pizza was waiting, and they had a chance to eat some pizza, and then went and played, and they got a superior rating. They did great. But I was thinking, these kids are going to arrive and they're going to be completely famished. And how can we expect them to perform at their best? And to this day, nobody in the band can believe that I did that. They said to Martin, your dad went and bought pizza for everybody. And the reason why I did that is because I'm touched by the fact that Jesus met his disciples' needs in a physical way, and God met Elijah's needs in a physical way. So don't despise a physical solution for dealing with what at times is simply physical depression. That's what we learn from Elijah. So what happens in verse 8? Who wants to read verse 8 for us? What happens in verse 8?
He gained his strength.
Yep. He regained his strength, and then he went in the strength of that food for 40 days and 40 nights to Horeb, the mountain of God. Wow, that was some good food. Yeah. That was some complex carbohydrates and some good protein, and it lasted.
Certainly was served by an angel.
Yeah, exactly. What do you expect? It's pretty good food. It's better than what you get at a water, isn't it?
Angel food cake.
Angel food cake. That's where we got the name Angel food cake. Okay, so what do we learn from Elijah? Somebody wants to summarize it. How do we deal with our depression?
To look into the physical factors as well, not to neglect that part.
Exactly.
It can be as simple as a nap.
Yeah, and something, and better nutrition.
Yeah.
You know? Okay, great. Now, we don't have a whole lot of time left, so I'm going to skip one of the passages and go to 2 Corinthians 7. And this will be our last passage. 2 Corinthians chapter 7. We're going to look at verses 5 through 7. 5 to 7. 2 Corinthians 7. This is the Apostle Paul writing to the church in the city of Corinth. He's giving his testimony. He's talked about something that happened, and it has relevance to depression. So who can read for us? 2 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 5 to 7. Who can read for us? Somebody got good eyes, better than mine?
For even when we came into Macedonia, our bodies had no rest, but we were afflicted at every turn, fighting without fear and fear within. But God, who comforts the downcast, comforted us by the coming of Titus, and not only by his coming, but also by the comfort with which he was comforted by you, as he told us of your longing, your mourning, your zeal for me, so that I rejoiced still more.
Okay, now there's a context to this. Paul had written the Corinthians a letter in 1 Corinthians, and he had told them, get your act together, people, because they had been tolerating sexual immorality. And he had told them to put the professing Christian out of the fellowship, and had told them to take action against this man who was not living according to Christian morality. And then they actually did what it was that Paul had told them to do. And then Paul is reflecting on what happened at this certain point, as the knowledge in verse 8 and in the end of verse 7, as the knowledge of how the Corinthians had responded to the immoral man got back to Paul. Then he talks about what that did for him, what that did for the church in Corinth. But we have to take this apart. Look at verse 5. Okay, where did Paul go? What city? Or what region? Macedonia. And how did he describe his situation? There's 3 descriptions. What's the first? In verse 5. What's the first thing he said? What?
No rest.
No rest. You know, our flesh, our bodies had no rest. Okay? And this can be taxing. Okay? And so what happened? Yeah, 2 things happened at this point. In addition to having no rest, what else happened? What's next? No rest. And what else did he have? Afflictions. What's an affliction? Yeah, it can be a problem or it can be a physical thing that happens to you. It's something bad that happens to you. So he had afflictions from...
In NIV, it says they were harassed at every turn. So they were harassed by others.
Persecution. So he was afflicted in persecution on every side. And that led to what at the end of that verse? What did they have? They had two things. What they have outside of themselves? They had something outside of themselves. What was it? Conflicts. They had conflicts everywhere. If there's anything that will make you depressed, it's constant interpersonal conflict with someone else. And when it goes on and on and on and on, and never stops, and it's on every side, it comes to you from your family, it comes to you at work, it comes to you from your friends, it comes to you from your spouse, then, there comes a time where if you don't get depressed, you're not even human. Because this is what happened. So they had conflicts without, but what do they have in addition? Fear within. They had affliction coming, persecution coming, and they got scared. So they didn't just have to deal with what everybody else was doing. They had to deal with their own fear. I don't agree with the famous American president that said, "There's nothing to fear but fear itself." That's crazy. There's a lot of things to fear. There are snakes in Indonesia that eat people while they're sleeping, okay? You should be afraid of that. I went snorkeling in Raja Ampat. You know Raja Ampat?
Yeah.
Great place to go snorkeling, #1 in the world. I'm snorkeling around, and I look around, and there's 2 sharks right by me. And that's not a time for, "Oh, lovely shark," and you start singing Baby Shark. Shark, do, shark. No, I wasn't thinking about Baby Shark. I have never kicked so fast with my fins because I got out of there and I got on top of the coral because I thought, shark can't get me here, shark can't get me here. Okay, I was scared to death. So there's times where fear is an appropriate reaction to what's going on, but it certainly can lead you into depression. But something happened to him in verse 6. What happened in verse 6? Or to them, Paul and his traveling partners, what happened to them? They got comfort. The answer in the New Testament, especially in 2 Corinthians, to depression is God bringing us comfort. And comfort ultimately comes from God. But we think of that in terms of God bringing his comfort to me directly. But actually, it's often not packaged that way. It comes to us in a different package. And what's the package in verse 6? It's not necessarily directly as he prays. How did it come? Right. Because Titus brought good news, and the good news was how they repented, responded to his first letter positively, and that helped them a lot when he realized how they responded with mourning over their sin, with zeal to do what was right in the Lord. So one of the things we learn from this is that other people can help you get out of your depression. Especially when other people bring good tidings of great joy of God's work in the lives of other people. So sometimes you're going to be depressed and you can't get out of it alone, and your friends can't get out of it alone. And when I hear that somebody's continually depressed, or if you ever hear the word that they say they want to kill themselves, that's the point where you need to move into action and try and immediately get them help. There's a friend of mine in my life who I've known for 26 years from Taiwan, and she's really struggled with depression. At times she struggled with suicide, and there's a few times where she actually tried to commit suicide, and we pulled her out of the Dan Shui River after she jumped in, but she jumped in the winter with a big coat, and so she floated. So guess what? Suicide 101, and you failed because we pulled you out. Well, we pulled this lady 3 times out of a suicidal situation, and you know what? God restored her. She's now married to a pastor, and she has a wonderful life, and she's never forgotten it. And every time I see her, she reminds me, she says, you and your wife, Effie, were there for me when I really needed somebody. You must take depression that causes a person to be suicidal very, very seriously, because you never know if they might actually do it. I have a friend in the U.S., and he had a son who got depressed, got suicidal, tried to kill himself 10 times in the space of a few years. So several years ago, I told my friend, I said, you know what you should do? You should buy one of those GPS tracker things and put it in his tennis shoe. So he pulled up, you know how a tennis shoe sometimes, how an athletic shoe has one of those things, an insert you can pull up. So my friend pulled it up, put the tracker in, and I said, put a tracker on his car in case he doesn't have his shoes on. So my friend put a tracker on both things. And when that son drove from a northern state down to the border of Mexico and was in a state right next to Mexico and slit his wrists, my friend had followed him and got to him a few minutes after he cut his wrists, and his life was saved. So you've got to take these things seriously and realize that sometimes people's depression can be very severe. And when people's depression is very severe, they can't get out of it themselves. They need someone to help them. And that someone could be you, that someone could be a medical professional, that someone could be the nurse at the mental hospital, that someone could be someone else, but there needs to be a someone. And for Paul and his traveling companions, when he wrote 2 Corinthians, there was a someone, and his name was Titus. And what he said encouraged Paul, and that helped Paul and his traveling companions to have the grace and the strength to go on. So as we think tonight about depression, I want to summarize everything we've learned. We've learned that depression is something that we can put ourselves in. Depression is something that we can sometimes get ourselves out. Depression is something that happens as a result of what other people do to us in situations that we can't control. But yet depression doesn't need to be the final situation, because we have the hope of God, we have the presence of God. We can call out to God, and He brings us that help, and sometimes He even brings us that help through the ministry of other people and what they do in our lives. Depression sometimes can be physical, sometimes it can be spiritual, where after you've had a great spiritual victory, that's the point where Satan's going to get you down and cause you just to say, I've had enough, I can't go on anymore. But in the midst of all this, we open our Bibles and we realize that our Bibles show us real saints who struggle with the same things that we do. So when we pick up the Bible, we can actually get a lot of help from it, because it tells us of people who are very human, very honest, very vulnerable, and they've opened their lives up to us in the Psalms, in Paul's letters, and in what we learn about Elijah, so that we can deal with the things that happen to us. So I hope that some of what you've seen in the Word of God tonight can give you some hope and some grace and some help when you struggle with depression, or when someone else you know struggles with depression. Pastor Jim, would you like to pray for us as we close?
Yes.
Let's just close in prayer and bow our heads, and Pastor Kim's going to lead us.
Almighty God, our Heavenly Father, we thank you that your word is full of helpful things, not just pie in the sky, but help where the rubber meets the road. And we thank you for the fruitful ways of thinking that Pastor Tim has helped us to tonight. That we can sometimes talk ourselves out of depression, but sometimes depression has a physical cause, like hunger, that we need to deal with, tired exhaustion, physical exhaustion, and we need to rest and eat before we are able to deal with it. And then there are those times that we can be so far down in the hole that we need others to come and find us and help us out of that. And we pray that you would equip us to be the kind of people that would be there for one another, and for others in those circumstances. Thank you for Pastor Tim and for his message tonight. And we ask him to bless him as he continues to heal from his surgeries. And as he goes for his further surgeries, we pray that you be with him and keep him from depression. And help us to be an encouragement to him as much as we can. We ask this in Christ our Lord. Amen.
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 Now there's one housekeeping